The first time Zariah Cole walked into the glass-walled headquarters of Halvern Dynamics, she didn't belong. And everyone could tell, not because she lacked confidence, but because she carried something far more intimidating than wealth: discipline, presence, power. Zariah wasn't just another visitor in a pressed uniform. She was the daughter of a long line of decorated service members, raised in a household where respect wasn't requested, it was earned. Her deep brown skin glowed under the soft corporate lighting, her posture straight, her chin lifted with quiet pride. There was something commanding about her stillness, something that made even the most arrogant executives pause for a second longer than they intended. The employees whispered, not loudly, but enough, because Halvern Dynamics was a world built on polished suits, inherited influence, and quiet competition. A world where legacy mattered more than integrity, and where people like Zariah were often misunderstood before they were even known. And at the very center of that world stood Caspian Hale, young, brilliant, untouchable, a CEO who had taken over his father's empire and expanded it beyond expectation. Tall, composed, with a presence that commanded rooms without effort, his life had been carefully constructed. Private schools, elite circles, curated relationships. Everything in his world had always made sense. Until their first meeting wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. But it was charged. Zariah had been assigned to liaise with Halvern Dynamics on a defense-related technology contract, a project that required both military oversight and corporate execution. She entered the boardroom with a calm authority, her voice steady, her words precise. Caspian noticed immediately, not just her beauty, though that alone was impossible to ignore, but the way she spoke, the way she didn't try to impress anyone, the way she didn't care if she did. It unsettled him, intrigued him, pulled him in. At first, their conversations were strictly professional, briefings, updates, strategic discussions. But slowly, something shifted. It started in the quiet moments, a glance that lingered a second too long, a conversation that drifted just slightly off topic, a shared silence that felt comfortable. Zariah wasn't like the women Caspian had known. She didn't laugh at everything he said. She didn't soften herself to fit into his world. She challenged him, questioned him, saw through him, and for the first time in his life, Caspian Hale felt like someone wasn't impressed by his name. They were seeing him. Their first real conversation happened late one evening. The office had emptied, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls. Zariah stood by the window, reviewing documents, her reflection blending into the skyline. Caspian approached, slower than usual. "Do you ever rest?" he asked. She didn't turn immediately. "Do you?" A pause, then a small smile tugged at his lips. That was the thing about her. She didn't answer questions the way people expected. That night, they talked, not as CEO and officer, but as two people from completely different worlds trying to understand each other. She told him about early mornings filled with drills, about family gatherings where stories of service were passed down like heirlooms, about growing up in a community where strength wasn't just physical, it was emotional, cultural, deeply rooted. He told her about boardrooms instead of playgrounds, about expectations that came before identity, about a life where every decision had already been made for him, long before he realized it. And somewhere between those conversations, something real began. Their relationship didn't explode overnight. It built, slowly, intentionally, like something that neither of them wanted to rush, and yet couldn't stop. There were quiet dinners where Zariah introduced him to flavors and music that told stories of her heritage, laughter filling spaces that had once felt too formal for emotion. There were high-profile events where Caspian for once didn't stand alone, his hand subtly resting at the small of her back, grounding himself in her presence. Two worlds, colliding, blending, learning, but not everyone was watching with admiration. Some were watching with concern, others with quiet disapproval, and a few with something far more dangerous, because in Caspian's world, love wasn't just about connection, it was about alignment, status, image, control, and Zariah didn't fit the mold they had already chosen for him. Still, he chose her, again and again, Even when conversations with his family grew colder, even when subtle comments turned into direct disapproval, even when the pressure began to build. And for Zariah, she allowed herself to believe in something she had never planned for, a future that didn't follow the rigid structure she had always known, a love that felt safe. Until the night, everything changed. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. Zariah stood in her apartment, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across the room. Her hand rested lightly against her abdomen, her thoughts racing in a way she had never experienced before. Because earlier that day, she had found out something that should have brought joy, but instead filled her with uncertainty. She was pregnant. And for the first time since meeting Caspian Hale, Zariah Cole didn't feel powerful. She felt vulnerable. The discovery of her pregnancy did not come with the kind of soft, glowing moment Zariah had imagined for other people. There were no tears of joy, no immediate laughter, no warm embrace waiting on the other side of the news. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost cautiously, like something sacred that needed to be protected before it could even be celebrated. She sat alone in her apartment that evening, still dressed in her uniform. Though the long day had already drained her energy, the city outside buzzed with life, but inside her space, everything felt suspended in time. Her hand rested gently against her abdomen, not out of habit yet, but out of instinct. Like her body already understood something her mind was still trying to process. Zariah Cole had faced pressure before. She had endured grueling training, survived emotionally demanding environments, and carried responsibilities that most people could not begin to comprehend. But this was different. This was not a mission she could strategize her way through, or a challenge she could overcome through discipline alone. This was personal. This was life-altering. And for the first time in a long time, she felt uncertain, not because she doubted herself, but because she knew the world she was stepping into was not hers alone. It was theirs, hers and Caspian's. When she finally decided to tell him, she did not choose a dramatic setting or a carefully orchestrated moment. Zariah had never been the kind of woman who needed grand gestures to validate her emotions. Instead, she invited him over under the quiet pretense of dinner. Something simple, something familiar. Caspian arrived later than expected, still dressed in his tailored suit, his presence carrying the weight of another long day filled with decisions, negotiations, and expectations. Yet the moment he stepped into her apartment, something about him softened. It always did when he was with her. There was a certain peace in her space that his world lacked, a warmth that couldn't be bought, a sense of grounding that made him feel human. "You look tired," she said gently, taking his coat as he stepped inside. "And you don't?" he replied with a faint smile, his eyes studying her more closely than usual. There was something different about her tonight, not distant, not cold, but heavier somehow, as though she were carrying more than just the weight of the day. They sat across from each other during dinner, their conversation starting as it always did, casual, steady, familiar. But underneath it all, there was an unspoken tension building, a quiet anticipation that neither of them addressed immediately. Zariah wasn't afraid. She wasn't unsure of her worth. But she was aware of the reality they lived in, a reality where love did not exist in isolation from expectation, and Caspian was a man deeply tied to expectation. She didn't drag the moment out. That wasn't her nature. After a pause in their conversation, she placed her fork down gently, her gaze steady as it met his. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. Caspian leaned back slightly, his expression shifting into quiet attentiveness. "What is it?" There was no fear in her voice when she spoke next, no hesitation, just truth. "I'm pregnant." For a brief moment, time seemed to stop, not in a dramatic, exaggerated way, but in a real human way, where the mind struggles to catch up with what it has just heard. Caspian didn't react immediately. His eyes searched hers, as though trying to determine whether she was serious, whether this was real, whether this moment was actually happening. And when he realized that it was, something inside him shifted. His first reaction was not rejection. It was not anger. It was shock, layered with something deeper, something complicated. "Zariah." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he stood from his seat, pacing once before stopping in front of her. "You're sure?" The question wasn't dismissive. It was instinctive. The kind of question someone asks when they're trying to process something that changes everything. "Yes," she replied calmly. "I've confirmed it." Another pause settled between them, heavier now, filled with thoughts neither of them were fully ready to voice. Caspian looked at her again, really looked at her this time, not just as the woman he loved, but as the woman standing before him with something that would permanently tie their lives together. And in that moment, there was a flicker of something genuine in his expression, something soft, something real. "You're going to be a mother," he said quietly, almost to himself. "And you're going to be a father," she replied, her voice steady but not cold. For a brief second, something beautiful existed between them, a fragile moment where the possibility of joy outweighed everything else. But reality has a way of entering even the most sacred spaces, and for Caspian Hale, reality came in the form of everything he had been raised to prioritize: his family, his name, his image, his future. "This isn't simple," he said finally, his tone shifting, not harsh but controlled. Zariah's eyes didn't leave his. "I never said it would be." He exhaled slowly, walking toward the window, his back to her now, as he stared out at the city lights. "You know what my world is like," he continued. "You know what's expected of me. And you know who I am," she responded, her voice calm but firm. "So don't talk to me like I don't understand pressure." That made him turn, because she wasn't wrong. She understood pressure better than most. But understanding didn't make this easier, because this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everything surrounding them, everything watching them, everything waiting to judge them. Before the conversation could go any further, his phone rang. The timing felt almost deliberate, almost inconveniently perfect. Caspian glanced at the screen, his expression tightening slightly before he answered, "Yes?" Zariah didn't try to listen. She didn't need to, because she already knew that tone, that shift, that world. The call was brief, but when he ended it, something had changed. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough. "I have to go," he said. Zariah didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable but not detached. "Now?" she asked. "Yes. It's important." There was a pause, not long, but long enough to matter. "More important than this?" she asked quietly. Caspian hesitated, and that hesitation said everything. "I'll come back," he said instead, reaching for his coat. But something about the way he said it didn't feel like a promise. It felt like avoidance. Zariah stood slowly, her posture straight, her composure intact, but there was a shift in her energy now. A quiet withdrawal, not dramatic, not emotional, but present. "Of course," she said. And just like that, he left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. But the silence that followed was anything but soft. Zariah remained standing for a moment, her gaze fixed on the door, long after he was gone. Not because she expected him to return, but because she was processing something she hadn't wanted to admit. Not fear, not weakness, but realization. Love, no matter how strong, does not exist untouched by pressure. And in that moment, for the first time, she understood just how heavy that pressure truly was. What she didn't know yet was that the call that pulled him away that night was not just business. It was the beginning of everything that would tear them apart. The discovery of her pregnancy did not come with the kind of soft, glowing moment Zariah had imagined for other people. There were no tears of joy, no immediate laughter, no warm embrace waiting on the other side of the news. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost cautiously, like something sacred that needed to be protected before it could even be celebrated. She sat alone in her apartment that evening, still dressed in her uniform. Though the long day had already drained her energy, the city outside buzzed with life, but inside her space, everything felt suspended in time. Her hand rested gently against her abdomen, not out of habit yet, but out of instinct, like her body already understood something her mind was still trying to process. Zariah Cole had faced pressure before. She had endured grueling training, survived emotionally demanding environments, and carried responsibilities that most people could not begin to comprehend. But this was different. This was not a mission she could strategize her way through, or a challenge she could overcome through discipline alone. This was personal. This was life-altering. And for the first time in a long time, she felt uncertain, not because she doubted herself, but because she knew the world she was stepping into was not hers alone. It was theirs, hers and Caspian's. When she finally decided to tell him, she did not choose a dramatic setting or a carefully orchestrated moment. Zoraya had never been the kind of woman who needed grand gestures to validate her emotions. Instead, she invited him over under the quiet pretense of dinner. Something simple, something familiar. Caspian arrived later than expected, still dressed in his tailored suit, his presence carrying the weight of another long day, filled with decisions, negotiations, and expectations. Yet the moment he stepped into her apartment, something about him softened. It always did when he was with her. There was a certain peace in her space that his world lacked, a warmth that couldn't be bought, a sense of grounding that made him feel human. "You look tired," she said gently, taking his coat as he stepped inside. "And you don't?" he replied with a faint smile, his eyes studying her more closely than usual. There was something different about her tonight, not distant, not cold, but heavier, somehow, as though she were carrying more than just the weight of the day. They sat across from each other during dinner, their conversation starting as it always did, casual, steady, familiar, but underneath it all, there was an unspoken tension building, a quiet anticipation that neither of them addressed immediately. Zoraya wasn't afraid, she wasn't unsure of her worth, but she was aware of the reality they lived in, a reality where love did not exist in isolation from expectation. And Caspian was a man deeply tied to expectation. She didn't drag the moment out. That wasn't her nature. After a pause in their conversation, she placed her fork down gently, her gaze steady as it met his. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. Caspian leaned back slightly, his expression shifting into quiet attentiveness. "What is it?" There was no fear in her voice when she spoke next, no hesitation, just truth. "I'm pregnant." For a brief moment, time seemed to stop, not in a dramatic, exaggerated way, but in a real, human way, where the mind struggles to catch up with what it has just heard. Caspian didn't react immediately. His eyes searched hers, as though trying to determine whether she was serious, whether this was real, whether this moment was actually happening. And when he realized that it was, something inside him shifted. His first reaction was not rejection. It was not anger. It was shock, layered with something deeper, something complicated. "Zoraya." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he stood from his seat, pacing once before stopping in front of her. "You're sure?" The question wasn't dismissive. It was instinctive, the kind of question someone asks when they're trying to process something that changes everything. "Yes," she replied calmly. "I've confirmed it." Another pause settled between them, heavier now, filled with thoughts neither of them were fully ready to voice. Caspian looked at her again, really looked at her this time, not just as the woman he loved, but as the woman standing before him with something that would permanently tie their lives together. And in that moment, there was a flicker of something genuine in his expression, something soft, something real. "You're going to be a mother," he said quietly, almost to himself. "And you're going to be a father," she replied, her voice steady but not cold. For a brief second, something beautiful existed between them, a fragile moment where the possibility of joy outweighed everything else. But reality has a way of entering even the most sacred spaces. And for Caspian Hale, reality came in the form of everything he had been raised to prioritize: his family, his name, his image, his future. "This isn't simple," he said finally, his tone shifting. Not harsh, but controlled. Zoraya's eyes didn't leave his. "I never said it would be." He exhaled slowly, walking toward the window, his back to her now, as he stared out at the city lights. "You know what my world is like," he continued. "You know what's expected of me. And you know who I am," she responded, her voice calm but firm. "So don't talk to me like I don't understand pressure." That made him turn, because she wasn't wrong. She understood pressure better than most, but understanding didn't make this easier. Because this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everything surrounding them, everything watching them, everything waiting to judge them. Before the conversation could go any further, his phone rang. The timing felt almost deliberate, almost inconveniently perfect. Caspian glanced at the screen, his expression tightening slightly before he answered. Yes? Zaraya didn't try to listen. She didn't need to, because she already knew that tone. That shift, that world. The call was brief, but when he ended it, something had changed. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough. I have to go, he said. Zaraya didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable but not detached. Now? She asked. Yes, it's important. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to matter. More important than this? She asked quietly. Caspian hesitated, and that hesitation said everything. I'll come back, he said instead, reaching for his coat. But something about the way he said it didn't feel like a promise. It felt like avoidance. Zaraya stood slowly, her posture straight, her composure intact, but there was a shift in her energy now. A quiet withdrawal. Not dramatic, not emotional, but present. Of course, she said. And just like that, he left. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but the silence that followed was anything but soft. Zaraya remained standing for a moment, her gaze fixed on the door long after he was gone. Not because she expected him to return, but because she was processing something she hadn't wanted to admit. Not fear, not weakness, but realization. Love, no matter how strong, does not exist untouched by pressure. And in that moment, for the first time, she understood just how heavy that pressure truly was. What she didn't know yet was that the call that pulled him away that night was not just business. It was the beginning of everything that would tear them apart. The call that pulled Caspian away that night did not come from a business partner, nor was it related to any urgent deal that required his immediate attention. It came from someone far more calculated, someone who had been watching, waiting, and carefully positioning herself for the right moment to step in. Her name was Vivienne Laurent. Vivienne was everything the Hale family had always envisioned for Caspian's future. She came from an established lineage, moved effortlessly within elite social circles, and understood the unspoken rules that governed power and influence. Her presence at high-profile events was expected, her name carried weight, and her reputation was carefully maintained. But beneath her polished exterior was a mind that observed more than it revealed. And recently, what she had been observing was Zaraya. Vivienne had first noticed her during a corporate gala months earlier, long before the relationship between Caspian and Zaraya had become obvious to the public eye. At first, she had dismissed her as just another professional, someone temporary, someone insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But over time, patterns began to emerge. Caspian's attention, his absence from certain gatherings, the subtle shift in his demeanor whenever Zaraya's name was mentioned. Vivienne didn't need confirmation. She understood enough. And she also understood something else. Zaraya Cole was not a woman who could be easily removed, so Vivienne didn't act immediately. She waited. She studied. She gathered information, not carelessly but strategically. Because if there was one thing she believed in, it was this: if you were going to dismantle something strong, you had to do it from the inside. The opportunity came in the form of Zaraya's military assignment, a classified operation that required coordination between multiple departments, including civilian contractors, one of which had indirect ties to Halvern Dynamics. Vivienne didn't have direct authority within military operations, but she had something just as effective: connections. By the time Caspian arrived at her penthouse that night, she was already prepared. The atmosphere was calm, controlled, almost welcoming, but there was an undercurrent of intention beneath it all. "You came quickly," she noted, setting down her glass as he stepped inside. "You said it was urgent," Caspian replied, his tone neutral but alert. Vivienne studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp but composed. "You've been distracted lately," she said. "That's not why I'm here," he responded. "No," she agreed softly, "but it's why this matters." She didn't rush into it. Vivienne never rushed. Instead, She walked toward the table and slid a file across its surface toward him. Caspian hesitated for a fraction of a second before opening it, and as his eyes moved across the contents, his expression changed. "What is this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more controlled. "Information," Vivian replied, "the kind you deserve to have." Inside the file were documents, reports, correspondence, fragments of conversations taken out of context, but arranged in a way that suggested something far more damaging. At the center of it all was Zariah. The implication was clear. Zariah Cole had allegedly been involved in a breach of protocol during a recent operation, one that hinted at compromised loyalty, questionable decisions, and potential misconduct. It wasn't proven, but it didn't need to be, not when it was presented this way. "This doesn't make sense," Caspian said, though there was less certainty in his voice than before. Vivian tilted her head slightly. "Doesn't it?" she asked. "Or does it just not align with what you want to believe?" Caspian closed the file, his jaw tightening. "She wouldn't do this." "You sound very sure," Vivian replied, her tone calm but pointed. For someone who hasn't known her very long, that struck something deeper than he expected. Because it wasn't just about the accusation, it was about doubt. And doubt, once introduced, has a way of growing quietly. "I'm not saying she's guilty," Vivian continued, her voice softening just enough to seem reasonable. "I'm saying you should be careful. People aren't always who they present themselves to be, especially when they have something to gain." Something to gain. The words lingered. Uncomfortable. Caspian didn't respond immediately, because for the first time, he didn't know how to, and somewhere, in the quiet space between trust and uncertainty, the foundation of something once unbreakable began to crack. What he didn't realize was that this wasn't just doubt. It was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated fall. The investigation did not begin with noise. There were no dramatic accusations thrown across crowded rooms, no immediate confrontations, no clear moment where Zariah Cole could point to and say, "This is where everything changed." Instead, it started quietly, almost invisibly, a delayed clearance approval, a request for additional documentation that had never been required before, a subtle shift in tone from colleagues who had once greeted her with familiarity and respect. At first, Zariah treated it as procedural inconvenience. Military operations often came with layers of scrutiny, especially when they involved sensitive collaborations with civilian entities. She had navigated far more complex situations before, and nothing about this seemed overtly threatening. But instinct is something you don't ignore when you've been trained to survive uncertainty, and her instinct was telling her something wasn't right. The first official notice came 3 days later. It arrived in the form of a sealed directive, marked with a level of authority that immediately signaled seriousness. Zariah stood in her office when she opened it, her expression composed as her eyes scanned the contents. But there was a tightening in her chest she could not dismiss. An internal review had been initiated. Her name was listed, not as a witness, but as a subject of concern. The allegation itself was carefully worded, wrapped in formal language that avoided direct accusation while implying enough to raise questions. It suggested that during a recent operation, there had been a lapse in judgment, one that could have compromised the integrity of the mission. It referenced communications that were now under review, decisions that were being re-evaluated, and actions that were unclear. To someone unfamiliar with the system, it might have seemed minor, but Zariah understood exactly what it meant. This wasn't just an inquiry. It was the beginning of doubt being placed on her record, and in her world, doubt was dangerous. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury she had never allowed herself. Instead, she did what she had always done. She prepared. She gathered her reports, reviewed her logs, retraced every step of the operation in question. Her memory was sharp, her documentation precise, and there was nothing in her actions that she could identify as misconduct, which meant one thing: if something appeared wrong, then something had been altered. The realization didn't come with fear. It came with clarity. Zariah wasn't being questioned because of what she had done. She was being questioned because someone wanted her to be. Meanwhile, across the city, in a world far removed from military protocol and disciplined order, Caspian Hale found himself standing in a boardroom, surrounded by people who spoke in calculated tones and measured opinions. But none of it held his focus the way it usually did, because his mind was elsewhere. He had tried to dismiss what Vivian showed him, tried to rationalize it as incomplete information, as something taken out of context, as a misunderstanding that would resolve itself. But the problem with doubt is that it doesn't require proof to exist. It only needs a reason, and once that reason is introduced, it lingers. Caspian had not returned to Zaraya's apartment the night she told him about the pregnancy. He had told himself it was because he needed time to think, to process, to understand how to handle something so significant. But if he were honest with himself, that wasn't the full truth. The full truth was that he didn't know how to face her, while uncertainty sat in the back of his mind. He didn't know how to look at her the same way, while questions, unwanted, uninvited, had begun to form, and instead of confronting those questions, he created distance. Zaraya noticed. Of course she did. She noticed the missed calls that weren't returned as quickly, the messages that felt shorter, less personal, the absence of his presence in moments where he would have once insisted on being there. But she didn't chase him. That wasn't who she was. Instead, she focused on what was in front of her, the investigation, her work, the life growing inside her. Still, there were moments, quiet, unguarded moments, where the absence settled into something heavier, not because she needed him to function, but because she had allowed herself to believe that he would be there, and belief, once shaken, leaves behind something difficult to ignore. The first formal questioning took place in a controlled setting, far removed from the familiarity of her usual environment. Zaraya sat across from two senior officers, their expressions neutral, their tone professional, but there was a distance in the room that hadn't existed before. They asked precise questions about timelines, about decisions, about communications that had allegedly taken place during the operation under review. Zaraya answered each one clearly, her voice steady, her posture unyielding. But, as the questioning continued, something became evident. They weren't asking to understand. They were asking to confirm a narrative that had already been presented to them. At one point, a document was placed in front of her, a printed exchange that allegedly involved her authorization of a decision she knew she had never made. Zaraya's eyes scanned the page, her expression unchanged, but inside, something hardened. "This isn't accurate," she said. The officer across from her tilted his head slightly. "It's been verified." "Then your verification process is flawed," she replied calmly. The room went still, because there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, only certainty. And certainty is difficult to challenge when it's real. But the problem wasn't her confidence. The problem was that the system she was facing had already been influenced. Far away from that room, in a quiet office filled with soft lighting and carefully curated decor, Vivienne Laurent stood by the window, her expression unreadable as she held her phone to her ear. "Yes," she said softly. "Proceed as planned." She ended the call without another word, placing the device down with deliberate calm. Everything was unfolding exactly as she intended, not too quickly, not too slowly, just enough pressure, just enough doubt, just enough distance. Because destruction, when done properly, doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers, and the first layer had already begun to settle. The investigation did not begin with noise. There were no dramatic accusations thrown across crowded rooms, no immediate confrontations, no clear moment where Zaraya Cole could point to and say, "This is where everything changed." Instead, it started quietly, almost invisibly, a delayed clearance approval, a request for additional documentation that had never been required before. A subtle shift in tone from colleagues who had once greeted her with familiarity and respect. At first, Zaraya treated it as procedural inconvenience. Military operations often came with layers of scrutiny, especially when they involved sensitive collaborations with civilian entities. She had navigated far more complex situations before, and nothing about this seemed overtly threatening. But instinct is something you don't ignore when you've been trained to survive uncertainty. And her instinct was telling her something wasn't right. The first official notice came 3 days later. It arrived in the form of a sealed directive, marked with a level of authority that immediately signaled seriousness. Zoraya stood in her office when she opened it, her expression composed as her eyes scanned the contents. But there was a tightening in her chest she could not dismiss. An internal review had been initiated. Her name was listed, not as a witness, but as a subject of concern. The allegation itself was carefully worded, wrapped in formal language that avoided direct accusation, while implying enough to raise questions. It suggested that during a recent operation, there had been a lapse in judgment, one that could have compromised the integrity of the mission. It referenced communications that were now under review, decisions that were being reevaluated, and actions that were unclear. To someone unfamiliar with the system, it might have seemed minor, but Zoraya understood exactly what it meant. This wasn't just an inquiry. It was the beginning of doubt being placed on her record, and in her world, doubt was dangerous. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury she had never allowed herself. Instead, she did what she had always done. She prepared. She gathered her reports, reviewed her logs, retraced every step of the operation in question. Her memory was sharp, her documentation precise, and there was nothing in her actions that she could identify as misconduct, which meant one thing: if something appeared wrong, then something had been altered. The realization didn't come with fear. It came with clarity. Zoraya wasn't being questioned because of what she had done. She was being questioned because someone wanted her to be. Meanwhile, across the city, in a world far removed from military protocol and disciplined order, Caspian Hale found himself standing in a boardroom surrounded by people who spoke in calculated tones and measured opinions, but none of it held his focus the way it usually did, because his mind was elsewhere. He had tried to dismiss what Vivian showed him, tried to rationalize it as incomplete information, as something taken out of context, as a misunderstanding that would resolve itself. But the problem with doubt is that it doesn't require proof to exist. It only needs a reason. And once that reason is introduced, it lingers. Caspian had not returned to Zoraya's apartment the night she told him about the pregnancy. He had told himself it was because he needed time to think, to process, to understand how to handle something so significant. But, if he were honest with himself, that wasn't the full truth. The full truth was that he didn't know how to face her, while uncertainty sat in the back of his mind. He didn't know how to look at her the same way while questions, unwanted, uninvited, had begun to form. And instead of confronting those questions, he created distance. Zoraya noticed. Of course she did. She noticed the missed calls that weren't returned as quickly, the messages that felt shorter, less personal, the absence of his presence in moments where he would have once insisted on being there. But she didn't chase him. That wasn't who she was. Instead, she focused on what was in front of her: the investigation, her work, the life growing inside her. Still, there were moments, quiet, unguarded moments, where the absence settled into something heavier, not because she needed him to function, but because she had allowed herself to believe that he would be there, and belief, once shaken, leaves behind something difficult to ignore. The first formal questioning took place in a controlled setting, far removed from the familiarity of her usual environment. Zoraya sat across from two senior officers, their expressions neutral, their tone professional. But there was a distance in the room that hadn't existed before. They asked precise questions about timelines, about decisions, about communications that had allegedly taken place during the operation under review. Zoraya answered each one clearly, her voice steady, her posture unyielding. But as the questioning continued, something became evident. They weren't asking to understand. They were asking to confirm a narrative that had already been presented to them. At one point, a document was placed in front of her, a printed exchange that allegedly involved her authorization of a decision she knew she had never made. Zoraya's eyes scanned the page, her expression unchanged, but inside, something hardened. "This isn't accurate," she said. The officer across from her tilted his head slightly. "It's been verified." "Then your verification process is flawed," she replied calmly. The room went still, because there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, only certainty, and certainty is difficult to challenge when it's real. But the problem wasn't her confidence. The problem was that the system she was facing had already been influenced. Far away from that room, in a quiet office filled with soft lighting and carefully curated decor, Vivienne Laurent stood by the window, her expression unreadable as she held her phone to her ear. "Yes," she said softly. "Proceed as planned." She ended the call without another word, placing the device down with deliberate calm. Everything was unfolding exactly as she intended. Not too quickly, not too slowly. Just enough pressure, just enough doubt, just enough distance, because destruction, when done properly, doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers. And the first layer had already begun to settle. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It built slowly, deliberately, like something tightening around Zaraya's life without ever fully revealing its source. Each day, the investigation seemed to grow more complex, more detailed, and more difficult to dismiss as routine. New documents surfaced. Revised timelines appeared. Fragments of communication, ones she did not recognize, were presented as if they had always existed. Zaraya reviewed everything with the same level of precision she had been trained to apply in the field. But the deeper she looked, the clearer it became that this was not a misunderstanding. It was not a clerical error, or a misinterpretation of events. It was constructed. Someone had taken pieces of reality and reshaped them into something else entirely, something convincing enough to withstand scrutiny, but false enough to destroy her. Even with that realization, she did not lose control. She refused to. Her strength had never come from reacting emotionally to pressure. It came from standing firm within it. But there was one place where her composure began to feel tested in a way she had not expected. Caspian. He had finally asked to see her, not in her apartment, not in any space that belonged to her, but in a quiet, private lounge within one of his company's executive buildings. The setting itself said everything she needed to know before he even spoke. This was not a visit. It was a conversation he had prepared for. When Zaraya walked in, she carried herself the same way she always did, composed, grounded, unshaken on the surface. Her presence still held that quiet authority, but there was a distance in her eyes now, a subtle shift that came from everything she had been dealing with alone. Caspian noticed it immediately, and for a brief moment, something inside him resisted what he had come to do. But hesitation, like doubt, does not last long when it is constantly reinforced. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice measured. Zaraya gave a small nod as she took a seat across from him. "You said it was important." There was a pause before he spoke again, one that stretched just long enough to create tension where there had once been ease. "I've been hearing things," he said finally. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. Zaraya did not react right away. She watched him carefully, studying his expression, the way his posture had changed, the subtle distance in his tone. She had faced interrogations before. She recognized this shift. "What kind of things?" she asked calmly. Caspian exhaled, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together as if grounding himself in the conversation. "About the operation you were involved in," he said. "About decisions that were made, actions that don't align with protocol." Zaraya's gaze did not waver. "And you believe them?" she asked. The question landed directly, without softness, without hesitation. Caspian didn't answer immediately, and that silence was enough. It told her everything she needed to know. For the first time since they had met, she saw it clearly. Not just the man she cared about, but the man shaped by the world he came from. A world where perception could outweigh truth, and where doubt, once introduced, was often treated as fact. "I'm trying to understand," he said, but even as he spoke, the words felt insufficient. Zaraya leaned back slightly, her expression steady, but no longer warm. "Then ask me," she said. "Don't sit here and speak in circles. If you want answers, ask me directly." There was a firmness in her tone now, not defensive, but resolute. Caspian hesitated again, then reached for a folder beside him. As he slid it across the table, something in Zaraya's chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. She already knew what it was. When she opened it, her eyes moved over the pages quickly, efficiently. Fabricated logs, altered communications, a narrative constructed with enough precision to appear legitimate to anyone who did not know the truth. Her expression didn't change, but something inside her did. "This is false," she said, closing the file and placing it back on the table. Caspian watched her closely. "It's detailed, Zaraya. So is a lie when someone puts effort into it," she replied. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet strength that refused to bend under pressure. "Then explain it to me," he said, his tone tightening slightly, "because from where I'm standing, this doesn't look like nothing." For a moment, the room felt smaller, not physically, but emotionally, because this was not just about the investigation anymore. This was about trust, and whether it still existed between them. Zaraya held his gaze, searching his face for something. Some sign that he still believed in her, that he still saw her the way he once had, but what she found instead was uncertainty, and that hurt more than any accusation ever could. "You're not asking me because you trust me," she said quietly. "You're asking me because you don't." The words settled heavily between them. Caspian opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out immediately. Because she was right, and he knew it. "I just need clarity," he said after a moment, though his voice lacked conviction. Zaraya shook her head slightly, not in frustration, but in understanding. "No," she said. "What you need is to decide whether you believe me or not." There was no anger in her tone, only truth. And truth, in moments like this, can feel heavier than anything else. Caspian looked away briefly, running a hand through his hair as the weight of everything pressed down on him. His family's expectations, Vivian's carefully planted doubts, the evidence sitting in front of him, and the woman across from him who refused to break under any of it. It would have been easier if Zaraya had been emotional, if she had raised her voice, if she had reacted in a way that made her seem uncertain. But she didn't. She remained exactly who she had always been, and somehow that made everything more complicated. "I'm under a lot of pressure right now," he said, the words sounding more like justification than explanation. Zaraya let out a quiet breath, her gaze softening for just a fraction of a second before settling back into something more guarded. "So am I," she replied. Another silence followed, longer this time, more final, because something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Zaraya stood slowly, her movements controlled, deliberate. "I've answered your questions," she said. "If you have more, you know how to reach me." There was a pause before she added, her voice quieter now, but still steady. "And if you ever decide to trust me again, you'll know where to find me for that too." Caspian looked up at her, something flickering in his eyes. Regret, uncertainty, something unresolved. But he didn't stop her. And that said more than anything else. Zaraya turned and walked away without hesitation, her posture as strong as ever, her presence as commanding as it had been the day they met. But inside, something had changed, not her strength, not her identity, but her expectations, because for the first time, she understood that love alone was not enough to withstand doubt. And in that realization, the distance between them became real, not just physical, but emotional. And once that kind of distance is created, it doesn't close easily. What Zaraya didn't know, as she stepped out of that building, was that the next move had already been set in motion. And this time, it wouldn't just create distance, it would break everything. The final blow did not come in private. It came in a room full of people. That was what made it unforgettable. That was what made it hurt in a way that lingered far beyond the moment itself. Zaraya had been formally summoned to attend a joint review session, one that included senior military officials, external observers, and a select group of corporate representatives tied to the operation. It was presented as a necessary step in maintaining transparency, but from the moment she walked into the room, she could feel that something about it was different. The atmosphere was heavier, not tense in an obvious way, but controlled, as though everyone present already understood the direction things were expected to go. Zaraya entered with her usual composure, her uniform pressed, her posture unshaken, her presence commanding without effort. She did not look like someone under investigation. She looked like someone who had spent her life standing firm in the face of pressure. But appearances, in moments like this, rarely dictate outcomes. What matters is perception, and perception had already been shaped. Caspian was there, seated among the observers, his expression carefully neutral, his presence both grounding and distant at the same time. For a brief second, their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, not warmth, not reassurance, but recognition of what this moment meant, of how far things had already shifted. Zoraya didn't look away first, but she didn't hold the gaze long either. There was no point, because whatever existed between them before was no longer guiding what was about to happen. The session began with formalities, statements, summaries of the situation that framed the narrative in a way that sounded objective, but felt anything but. The language was polished, carefully chosen to suggest concern rather than accusation. But the direction was clear. Zoraya Cole's actions were being questioned. Her judgment was being evaluated. Her integrity was under scrutiny. She listened without interruption, her expression calm, her focus sharp. She had already reviewed most of the material being presented, already identified the inconsistencies, already prepared her responses. But preparation does not always guarantee fairness, and fairness was not what this moment was about. The first piece of evidence was projected onto the screen, a sequence of communications that allegedly showed her authorizing a deviation from protocol during a critical phase of the operation. Zoraya's eyes narrowed slightly as she reviewed it, not because she was confused, but because she recognized exactly how it had been altered. "This is incomplete," she said, her voice steady as she addressed the room. One of the senior officers leaned forward slightly. "In what way?" Zoraya stood, moving closer to the screen, her presence drawing attention without effort. "The timestamps don't align with the actual operation timeline," she explained, "and the authorization sequence has been rearranged. This isn't the full communication log." There was a brief murmur among some of the attendees, but it was quickly quieted. The officer's expression remained unchanged. "Are you suggesting the report has been falsified?" "I'm stating that it's inaccurate," Zoraya replied. Her tone did not rise, it did not waver, but it carried certainty. And certainty, in a room built on controlled narratives, is often seen as resistance. The questioning continued, each point building on the last, each piece of evidence presented with increasing confidence. Witness statements were referenced, individuals who claimed to have observed irregularities, decisions that seemed out of character, actions that suggested something more than a simple mistake. Zoraya responded to each one, calmly, precisely, without hesitation, but something became clear as the session progressed. This was not an investigation seeking truth. This was a process confirming a conclusion. And once a conclusion has been decided, everything else becomes secondary. At one point, a senior official turned directly to her. "Lieutenant Cole," he said, his tone measured, given the inconsistencies and concerns raised. "Do you maintain that your conduct during the operation was entirely within protocol?" There it was, the moment designed to corner her, to force doubt, to create hesitation. But Zoraya did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. The room went still, not because her answer was unexpected, but because of how certain it was. There was no room for interpretation in her response, no attempt to soften it, no effort to adjust it to fit the narrative being presented. Just truth. And sometimes, truth stands alone. The official nodded slowly, as though acknowledging her statement, though there was no real agreement behind the gesture. Noted. And just like that, her certainty was reduced to a line in a report. The session continued for another hour, each moment reinforcing what had already been set in motion. By the time it concluded, the outcome had not been officially declared, but it didn't need to be. Zoraya understood. She had seen enough. As the room began to clear, conversations resumed in low tones, controlled and distant. Some avoided looking at her altogether. Others offered brief nods that carried more formality than respect. Caspian remained where he was, watching, thinking, but not moving. Zoraya gathered her things without rushing, her movements composed, her expression unreadable. When she finally turned to leave, she did not look toward him again, because there was nothing left to say in that space. Nothing left that would change what had just happened. But as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Zariah." It wasn't loud, but it carried. She paused, just for a moment, then turned. Their eyes met again, and this time, the distance between them felt undeniable. "I didn't expect it to go like this," he said. The words sounded hollow the moment they left his mouth. Zariah studied him for a second, not with anger, not with resentment, but with something far more difficult to face: disappointment. "You didn't stop it either," she replied. There was no accusation in her tone, just truth. And that truth landed harder than anything else could have. Caspian opened his mouth as if to respond, but again, nothing came, because there was nothing he could say that would undo what had just happened. Zariah gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in closure. Then she turned and walked away. This time, she didn't pause. She didn't look back, and the sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway marked the moment everything between them truly broke. What she didn't know yet was that this wasn't the end of the fall. It was only the beginning, because the next step wouldn't just question her integrity. It would take everything from her and leave her standing alone. At the moment she needed someone the most, the official decision came sooner than it should have, not because the investigation had reached a fair conclusion, but because the outcome had already been decided long before Zariah ever stepped into that review room. What followed was not justice. It was resolution, swift, quiet, and devastating in its finality. Zariah stood in full uniform when the notice was delivered, her expression calm as she read through the document that summarized everything she had already come to understand. She was being relieved of her current assignment pending further review. Her access was restricted. Her name would remain under investigation for conduct deemed inconsistent with military expectations. The wording was careful, measured, but the implication was clear. Her reputation had been stained, and in her world, reputation was not something easily restored. The news did not stay contained within official channels. It never does. By the end of the week, whispers had begun to circulate beyond military walls, reaching into social spaces where perception mattered more than truth. Stories were shared, assumptions were made, and narratives were accepted without question. To some, she became a cautionary tale. To others, a quiet scandal. And to a few, exactly what they needed her to be. Zariah did not defend herself publicly. She did not chase rumors or attempt to correct every false version of her story. That was not how she had been raised, and it was not how she carried herself now. Her strength had never depended on public approval, but strength does not make you immune to consequence. And consequence was beginning to settle into every part of her life. Caspian watched it all unfold from a distance that he had created, but did not fully understand. At first, he told himself that he needed space to think clearly, that stepping back would allow him to see things objectively. He followed the updates, read the reports, listened to the conversations happening within his own circles. Each one seemed to reinforce the same narrative. Zariah had made a mistake. Zariah had crossed a line. Zariah was not who she appeared to be, and the more he heard it, the harder it became to separate truth from repetition. Vivian made sure of that. She never pushed too hard, never spoke with urgency or emotion. Instead, she offered quiet observations, subtle reminders, carefully placed doubts that felt less like manipulation and more like concern. "I don't think you're seeing this clearly," she said one evening as they sat across from each other in a dimly lit private lounge. Caspian didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the glass in his hand. "You're too close to it," she continued. "And when you're that close, it's easy to overlook things that are right in front of you." He exhaled slowly. "Or maybe I'm the only one who's actually seeing her for who she is," he said, though there was less certainty in his voice than before. Vivian tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Then why does everything else say otherwise?" That question lingered long after the conversation ended, because it wasn't just about evidence anymore. It was about isolation. Zariah stood alone in her truth, and everyone else seemed to stand against it. The night Caspian finally went to see her again, the air between them felt different before a single word was spoken. Zariah opened the door without hesitation, her posture as composed as ever. but there was no softness in her expression this time, no quiet warmth waiting beneath the surface. Only distance, only awareness, only the understanding that something had already shifted beyond repair. Caspian stepped inside, his presence filling the space the way it always had, but the familiarity between them felt altered, not gone, but strained. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because sometimes silence says more than words ever could. "I heard about the decision," he said finally. Zariah nodded once, moving further into the room. "I'm sure you did." Her tone wasn't cold, but it wasn't inviting either. Caspian watched her carefully, trying to read something in her expression, something that might tell him how to approach this, how to fix something he didn't fully understand how to repair. "You didn't tell me," he said. Zariah turned to face him, her eyes steady. "What would you have done if I had?" The question wasn't confrontational, it was real, and it left him without an immediate answer. "I would have been there," he said after a moment, though even as he spoke, the words lacked the weight they once would have carried. Zariah held his gaze, searching it, measuring it. "You weren't there before," she replied quietly. "Why would this be different?" That landed harder than anything else she had said, because it wasn't said with anger, it was said with truth. Caspian stepped closer, his voice lowering. "I didn't know what to believe," he admitted. "There was too much, too many questions. And instead of asking me," Zariah said, her voice steady but firm, "you chose to believe everything else." "I didn't choose." "You did," she interrupted, not raising her voice but not allowing him to redirect the conversation either. "You chose distance. You chose silence. You chose doubt." The room felt heavier now, filled with everything that had gone unspoken for too long. Caspian ran a hand through his hair, frustration building beneath the surface. "This isn't simple, Zariah." "It never was," she replied. "But I didn't walk away when it got complicated." Another silence followed, one that felt final, because this wasn't about misunderstanding anymore. It was about choices, and the ones that had already been made. Caspian looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment, something flickered in his expression. Something close to regret, something close to realization. But realization, when it comes too late, doesn't change outcomes. "I can't do this," he said finally. The words were quiet, but they carried enough weight to change everything. Zariah didn't react immediately. She didn't ask him to explain. She didn't try to stop him, because she already understood what he meant. "You can't stand beside me," she said softly. It wasn't a question. It was a conclusion. Caspian didn't correct her, and that was answer enough. Zariah let out a slow breath, her shoulders remaining straight, her composure intact, even as something deeper settled into place within her. Not pain, not weakness, but acceptance. "Then don't," she said. There was no anger in her voice, no pleading, no desperation, just quiet finality. Caspian hesitated for a fraction of a second, as though something inside him was urging him to say more, to do more, to fix something that was clearly breaking, but he didn't. And then he turned. The sound of the door closing behind him was soft, but the impact it left behind was anything but. Zariah stood alone in the silence that followed, her hands slowly resting against her abdomen as the reality of everything settled around her. Not just the investigation, not just the damage to her name, but the one thing she had not prepared herself for. He had chosen to walk away, and she was carrying his children. That night, something inside Zariah Cole did not break. It hardened. It shifted. It transformed into something stronger than love, self-reliance, because from that moment on, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. She was on her own, and she would never allow herself to be in a position like that again. The humiliation did not come as a single moment. It unfolded in layers, each one stripping away something Zariah had once held steady, her name, her standing, and finally, the quiet dignity she had carried even through the investigation. What made it worse was not just what was said, it was where it was said. The military held a formal briefing, one that was meant to address recent concerns and reassure affiliated parties that standards were being upheld. It was positioned as a controlled release of information, but in reality, it became something far more damaging. Zariah was not invited to speak. She was not given a platform to defend herself. Instead, she was referenced, summarized, reduced to a situation that needed to be managed. Statements were made carefully, but the implication behind them was unmistakable. Words like questionable judgment and procedural inconsistency were used with precision, creating an image that was easy for the public to interpret without needing explicit accusation. And that was all it took, because once a narrative is presented in a controlled setting, it spreads without resistance. Within hours, the story moved beyond official channels and into the public space. Conversations that had once been quiet became louder, more confident, more certain. People who had never met Zariah spoke about her as though they understood her, as though they knew what had happened, as though the version of events presented to them was the only one that existed. For Zariah, the moment she realized how far it had gone was not during the briefing itself. It was afterward, when she stepped outside and felt the shift, the stares, the pauses in conversation as she walked past, the subtle but unmistakable change in how people looked at her, not with respect, not even with curiosity, but with assumption. It would have been easier if she had done something wrong. At least then, the weight of the moment would have matched the reality of her actions. But standing there, knowing the truth, knowing how carefully everything had been constructed against her, that was something else entirely. Still, she did not break, not outwardly, not where anyone could see. She returned to her apartment that evening with the same measured steps she had taken all her life. Her uniform was still pressed, her posture still straight, her presence still composed. But the moment the door closed behind her, the silence felt different, not empty, but heavy. Zariah moved slowly through the space, her fingers brushing lightly against the back of a chair, the edge of a table, grounding herself in something real. Her hand eventually came to rest against her abdomen again, this time not out of instinct, but out of connection, a reminder that she was not alone, even if it felt that way. The events of the past weeks replayed in her mind, not in fragments, but in clarity. Every moment, every decision, every shift in tone and trust, and at the center of it all, Caspian, not because he had created this situation, but because, when it mattered most, he had stepped away from it. Zariah closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself to feel something she had been holding back. Not weakness, not defeat, but grief. Not for the investigation, not for the reputation she would rebuild, but for the love she had believed in. She had trusted him, not blindly, not foolishly, but fully, and that kind of trust, once broken, does not leave quietly. When she opened her eyes again, something had changed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't visible to anyone else, but it was there, a shift in focus, a recentering of self. Zariah walked toward the window, looking out at the city that continued moving, as though nothing had changed. Cars still passed, lights still flickered in distant buildings, life still went on, and so would she, because Zariah Cole was not defined by perception. She was not shaped by rumor, and she would not allow herself to be reduced to a version of her life that someone else had written. If they wanted her to fall, they had underestimated her. That night, she made a decision, not out of emotion, but out of clarity. She would step away from the environment that had already judged her, from the system that had turned against her, from the version of her life that had become entangled with doubt and betrayal. It was not an act of surrender, it was strategy, because sometimes the strongest move is not to fight within a broken system, but to rebuild outside of it. The next morning, her resignation request was submitted. It was concise, direct, without unnecessary explanation. Those who received it were surprised. Some saw it as confirmation of guilt, others as avoidance, but none of those interpretations mattered, because for Zariah, this was not about proving anything to them anymore. It was about reclaiming control. In the weeks that followed, she disappeared from the spaces that had once defined her. No public statements, no attempts to correct the narrative, no visible effort to defend her name to the outside world. She was gone, but in reality, she was beginning again, alone, pregnant, and carrying not just the weight of her past, but the responsibility of what came next. She returned to the one place that had always grounded her: her family. Their home was not extravagant, not defined by wealth or status, but by something far more enduring: foundation, discipline, love that did not need validation from the outside world. The moment she stepped through the door, she was not Lieutenant Cole. She was Zariah, daughter. Strength, legacy. They did not ask her to explain everything. They did not question her choices. They did not measure her worth against what had been said about her. They stood beside her, without hesitation, without condition, and for the first time since everything began, Zariah allowed herself to breathe without pressure. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and slowly, the life she had known began to fade into something distant. But in its place, something stronger was forming. Because pain, when met with resilience, does not destroy, it transforms, and Zariah Cole was transforming into something no one had prepared for. Not just a survivor, not just a woman reclaiming her life, but a force, one that would return one day, not to prove them wrong, but to show them exactly who they underestimated. And when that day came, nothing would be the same. Zariah's return home was not a retreat. It was a recalibration. The house she grew up in stood in a quiet, deeply rooted community where culture was not something performed, it was lived. Mornings carried the scent of seasoned breakfasts and soft music playing in the background. Evenings were filled with conversation, laughter, and stories that stretched across generations. It was a place where identity was not questioned, where strength was not explained, and where love did not need conditions to exist. For the first time in months, Zariah was surrounded by something steady, something real, something that reminded her of who she had been, long before the world tried to redefine her. Her mother, Imani Cole, was a woman whose presence alone carried authority, not loud, not forceful, but deeply respected. She had spent years balancing discipline with warmth, raising her children to understand that strength was not just about endurance, it was about knowing when to stand firm and when to rebuild. Her father, Malik Cole, was quieter but no less powerful. A retired serviceman, he understood without explanation what his daughter had been through. He didn't press her for answers. He didn't demand explanations. He simply stood beside her, and sometimes that kind of support speaks louder than anything else. They knew something had happened. They could see it in her eyes, in the way she moved, in the silence she carried into spaces that had once been filled with her voice. But they didn't force her to speak before she was ready. They gave her something far more valuable: time. As the weeks passed, Zariah settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar at first. Life without structured commands, without constant movement, without the weight of official responsibility pressing against every decision she made. But this stillness did not weaken her. It strengthened her in a different way. Her pregnancy progressed steadily, each passing day making the reality of what lay ahead more tangible. There were moments of quiet reflection, moments where she would sit alone and think about the life she was bringing into the world, not with fear, but with intention. She spoke to them sometimes, softly, not because she expected a response, but because it grounded her, reminded her that no matter what had been taken from her, something meaningful was still growing within her. Her family embraced the transition fully. Her mother made sure she was cared for, not in an overbearing way, but in a way that felt natural. Meals prepared with care, small reminders to rest, conversations that kept her connected to the world beyond her thoughts. Her father, on the other hand, brought a different kind of support. He trained with her, not intensely, not in a way that pushed her beyond her limits, but enough to keep her grounded in her physical strength. Morning walks turned into light drills, not because she needed to prove anything, but because movement reminded her of who she was. She was still strong, still capable, still in control. Months passed, and with them came change, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. Zariah was no longer the woman who had walked out of that apartment, with quiet devastation sitting beneath her composure. She had processed it, understood it, accepted it, and most importantly, she had moved beyond it. There were moments, of course, when memories surfaced, when thoughts of Caspian crossed her mind, not in longing, but in reflection. She didn't hate him. That would have been easier. But what she felt instead was something more complex: disappointment and distance, because the man she had loved was not the man who had stood beside her when everything fell apart. That truth no longer broke her. It simply existed. The day the twins were born came without chaos, without panic, but with quiet intensity. Zariah handled it the way she handled everything else, with control, focus, and strength that didn't need to be announced. Her mother stayed by her side, her presence steady, her voice calm. Her father waited just outside, pacing only slightly, though his usual composure remained intact. Hours passed, and then everything changed. The first cry filled the room with a sound that was small but powerful enough to shift everything around it. Then the second followed. Twins. Zariah lay back, her breathing steadying as she turned her head slightly, her eyes landing on the two small lives that had just entered the world. For a moment, everything else faded. The past, the betrayal, the accusations, the loss. None of it mattered in that space, because what stood before her now was hers. The nurse gently placed them closer, and for the first time, Zariah allowed something to break through her composure. Not weakness, not vulnerability, but emotion, real, unfiltered, earned. "They're strong," her mother said softly. Zariah's lips curved slightly, her gaze soft but focused. "They have to be," she replied. She didn't say it out of expectation. She said it out of certainty, because they came from her strength, from her resilience, from everything she had endured and everything she had refused to let define her. In that moment, Zariah made another decision, one that would shape everything that came next. Her children would not grow up defined by what had happened to her. They would grow up understanding strength, identity, and self-worth from the very beginning. They would know who they were, and they would never need validation from a world that had once tried to tear their mother down. As she held them, one in each arm, something settled into place within her. Not just purpose, but direction. Because this was no longer just about rebuilding her life. It was about building theirs. And Zariah Cole did not do anything halfway. What no one knew at the time was that the woman who had quietly stepped away from everything was not gone. She was preparing, and when she returned, it would not be as someone seeking redemption. It would be as someone who no longer needed it. Motherhood did not slow Zariah down. It refined her. There was a rhythm to her days now, one that blended discipline with care, structure with warmth. Early mornings no longer began with orders or briefings, but with soft cries, tiny hands reaching for her, and the quiet responsibility of nurturing two lives that depended entirely on her. Yet even in that shift, she did not lose herself. She evolved. Raising twins required more than strength. It required balance, something Zariah mastered with a precision that felt almost natural. One child was observant from the very beginning, eyes constantly tracking movement, absorbing the world with a quiet intensity. The other was expressive, responsive, reacting to voices, sounds, and touch with an emotional awareness that felt almost instinctive. They were different, but equally remarkable, and Zariah saw it early. She named them Kyle and Cairo, names that carried presence, names that would grow with them. As they grew, so did her vision. Zariah did not return to her old life. She built a new one. It began quietly. Connections she had once made during her service, people who had seen her work firsthand, who had trusted her judgment, who had questioned the narrative that had been placed over her name, began to reach out, not publicly, not loudly, but with intention. Opportunities followed. Advisory roles, strategic consultations, private security assessments for organizations that valued discretion over publicity. Zariah accepted only what aligned with her standards. She did not rush. She did not overextend. She moved with purpose. Her reputation, though damaged in one space, began to rebuild in another, not through statements or defenses, but through action, consistency, results. People who worked with her didn't see scandal. They saw precision, clarity, control, and slowly, quietly, her name began to carry weight again, not in the same circles that had turned against her, but in circles that valued something deeper than perception. Over time, those circles expanded. What started as consulting turned into leadership. What began as advisory roles grew into influence. Zariah established a firm, one that operated at the intersection of security, strategy, and intelligence. It wasn't public in the way traditional corporations were. It didn't seek attention. It commanded respect. Her approach was different. She built a team that reflected her values, individuals who had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed in traditional systems, but carried skill, discipline, and loyalty that could not be taught. Together, they created something formidable, something controlled, something effective, and Zariah stood at the center of it all, not as someone seeking validation, but as someone who had already proven herself, first to herself, and now to the world that had once doubted her. Years passed. 6 of them. Kyle and Cairo grew into themselves in ways that made it impossible not to notice their potential. Kyle, the more reserved of the two, developed an early affinity for structure and logic. He asked questions that went beyond his age, analyzed situations with quiet precision, and carried himself with a calm confidence that mirrored his mother. Cairo, on the other hand, moved through the world with expressive energy. He connected easily with people, understood emotions in ways that felt intuitive, and possessed a natural ability to lead, even in small, everyday moments. Together, they were balanced, sharp, aware. Zariah raised them with intention, not just academically, but culturally. They understood where they came from. They were surrounded by music, language, and traditions that reflected their heritage. Family gatherings were filled with storytelling, laughter, and lessons woven into conversation. They learned respect not as a rule, but as a way of being. But she also prepared them for the world beyond their home. They trained, lightly at first, then with more structure as they grew older, not in a way that burdened them, but in a way that built discipline, awareness, confidence. They were not just children. They were being shaped into individuals who would understand strength in all its forms. And Zariah, she watched it all with a quiet pride she rarely expressed openly. Her own transformation had not gone unnoticed either. Within certain circles, private, influential, controlled, her name carried a different kind of recognition now. Not Lieutenant Cole, not the woman tied to a past investigation, but something else entirely. A strategist, a leader, a force, and eventually, the title followed. General. It wasn't handed to her easily. It wasn't given out of sympathy or correction. It was earned. Through years of consistent excellence, through quiet but undeniable impact, through a reputation that had rebuilt itself stronger than before, Zariah Cole had not just recovered, she had risen. And yet, despite everything she had built, everything she had become, there was one part of her life she kept completely separate from all of it. Her past. Caspian Hale was not a name spoken in her home, not because she avoided it out of pain, but because it no longer held relevance in the life she had created. Her children knew nothing about him, not yet. To them, their world was complete. Their mother was enough. Their family was enough. Their identity was enough. And Zariah intended to keep it that way. Until the day came when the past would no longer stay where it belonged. Because no matter how far you move forward, some things have a way of finding their way back. And when they do, they don't ask for permission. They arrive. By the time Kyle and Cairo turned 6, it was already clear they were not ordinary children. Not in the way they spoke, not in the way they observed the world, and certainly not in the way they carried themselves. Their home had become a space where growth was intentional. Every room reflected balance, structure and warmth, discipline and creativity. Zariah made sure of that. She did not raise them in isolation from the world, but she was careful about what she allowed to shape them. They were exposed to knowledge early. Books filled their shelves, not just the kind meant for children, but ones that challenged thought, encouraged curiosity, and built awareness. Conversations at home were never dismissed as too advanced for them. If they asked, she answered. Clearly, honestly, and in a way that respected their intelligence. Kyle, the older by minutes, had a mind that moved with quiet precision. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it carried weight. He analyzed before reacting, observed before speaking, and questioned things in a way that often left adults pausing longer than they expected. He enjoyed patterns, structure, and problem-solving. Numbers made sense to him. Systems made sense to him. Even human behavior, though more complex, seemed to interest him in a way that suggested he was always trying to understand how things worked beneath the surface. Zariah noticed it early, and she nurtured it carefully. Cairo, on the other hand, moved through life with a different kind of intelligence. He felt things deeply, but he was not overwhelmed by emotion. He understood it. He connected with people easily, reading expressions, tone, and energy in ways that felt almost instinctive. Where Kyle saw systems, Cairo saw people. He asked different questions. Why did he sound sad? Why did she look away when she said that? He didn't just want answers. He wanted understanding. Together, they balanced each other in a way that felt natural. Kyle grounded Cairo. Cairo opened Kyle. And Zariah. She guided both. Their mornings often began before sunrise, not because they were forced to wake early, but because routine had become part of who they were. Zariah would take them outside, where the air was still cool and quiet, and guide them through light exercises. Nothing intense, nothing excessive, but enough to build discipline, awareness of their bodies, control. She never raised them with pressure, only expectation, and there was a difference. Strength isn't about proving anything to anyone, she told them once as they trained. It's about knowing who you are, even when no one is watching. Kyle absorbed the words quietly. Cairo repeated them later, not because he needed to remember them, but because he understood their meaning in his own way. Beyond physical training, their education was just as intentional. Zariah made sure they attended a school that challenged them, one that recognized their abilities without isolating them from others. She did not want them growing up believing they were above anyone. She wanted them to grow up understanding responsibility. Their teachers noticed it quickly. Kyle's ability to process information, far beyond his level. Cairo's natural leadership, the way other children seemed to gravitate toward him without effort. There were moments that stood out, moments that hinted at what they would become. One afternoon, Kyle solved a complex problem meant for students years ahead of him, not by guessing, but by explaining each step in a way that made it impossible to dismiss as luck. Another time, Cairo stepped between two children during a disagreement, not with force, but with words that calmed the situation in a way most adults struggled to achieve. Zariah didn't praise them excessively. She acknowledged them, guided them, challenged them, because she understood something most people didn't. Talent, without direction, can lose its purpose. At home, their bond with her was something deeper than routine or responsibility. It was connection. They trusted her, not just as a parent, but as someone who listened. There were evenings when the three of them sat together, the noise of the outside world fading into the background as conversations flowed naturally. Sometimes it was about their day. Sometimes it was about questions that had no simple answers. And sometimes it was about things they didn't fully understand yet. "Do we have a father?" Cairo asked one night, his voice quiet but direct. The question didn't surprise Zariah. She had always known it would come. Kyle looked up as well, his gaze steady, not emotional, but attentive. He wanted to hear the answer too. Zariah didn't rush her response. She never did. "You do," she said calmly. Cairo tilted his head slightly. "Where is he?" There was no tension in the room, no discomfort, just curiosity. Zariah met their eyes, her expression composed, her voice steady. "He made a choice a long time ago," she said, "and that choice meant he wasn't part of this life." Cairo frowned slightly, trying to understand. Was it a bad choice? Zariah paused, considering her words carefully. "It was a choice that didn't align with who we are," she replied. Kyle nodded once, as if that answer made sense to him. Cairo took a little longer, but eventually he nodded too. They didn't ask more that night, not because they didn't care, but because they trusted that when the time came, they would understand. Zariah watched them quietly after that, something thoughtful settling behind her eyes. She had not lied, but she had not told them everything either, because some truths require the right moment, and that moment was closer than she realized. Elsewhere, in a world that had continued moving without her, Caspian Hale stood at the center of everything he had once believed mattered. His company had grown, his influence had expanded. His life looked exactly the way it had been expected to, but there was something missing, something he didn't speak about, something he didn't fully confront, and soon, that absence would no longer remain unnoticed, because the life he walked away from had not only survived, it had evolved, and when it returned into his world, it would not do so quietly. 6 years had given Caspian Hale everything he was supposed to want. His company had expanded beyond its original reach, securing international contracts, partnerships, and influence that placed him among the most respected figures in his industry. His name carried weight in rooms filled with power, and his presence was no longer questioned. It was expected. From the outside, his life reflected success in its most polished form, structured, stable, untouchable. And beside him stood the woman who had always fit that world perfectly. Vivienne Laurent had not just remained in his life. She had secured her place within it. Their engagement had been announced 2 years earlier, celebrated across elite circles as a union that made perfect sense. She was poised, strategic, and deeply aligned with everything his family valued. She understood appearances. She understood influence. And most importantly, she understood control. Their relationship was not chaotic. It was not uncertain. It functioned, but it lacked something that neither of them openly acknowledged. Caspian moved through his days with precision, his schedule carefully structured, his decisions calculated. He attended meetings, led negotiations, and carried himself with the same authority that had defined him for years. But there were moments, quiet, unguarded moments, when something else surfaced. Not regret in the way most people would recognize it, but something unfinished. It showed up in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses that lasted just a second longer than they should have, in the way certain memories would surface without invitation, only to be pushed aside just as quickly. He never spoke Zariah's name, not to Vivienne, not to his colleagues, not even to himself, but silence does not erase memory. It only buries it, and buried things have a way of resurfacing. Vivienne noticed more than she revealed. She always had. She understood Caspian in ways that allowed her to maintain her position without needing constant reassurance. She didn't demand affection. She didn't seek emotional depth. She maintained balance, and in her world, balance was power. But even she could sense that there were parts of him she did not fully occupy, parts that remained untouched, unresolved. She never confronted it directly, because doing so would require acknowledging something she preferred to keep controlled. Instead, she focused on what she could influence, the upcoming gala. It was one of the most significant events of the year, hosted by Halvern Dynamics in collaboration with several high-level partners. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a statement. Power, reach, reputation, everything that defined their world would be on display. Vivienne took charge of the planning with her usual precision, ensuring that every detail aligned with the image they needed to present. The guest list was carefully curated, the venue selected for its exclusivity, and the atmosphere designed to reflect quiet luxury. Nothing was left to chance. "This event needs to reinforce stability," she said one evening, as she reviewed final arrangements with Caspian. "People need to see consistency, confidence." Caspian nodded, his attention split between her words and the documents in front of him. "They will," he replied. Vivienne studied him briefly, then continued. "And it's also the right time to make certain things official." Caspian looked up slightly. "What do you mean?" She held his gaze, her expression composed. "Our engagement has been public for some time. This is an opportunity to take the next step. Announce the wedding." The suggestion settled into the space between them, not unexpected, not unreasonable, but not something he had been actively moving toward either. Caspian leaned back slightly, considering it. "It's a big step," he said. Vivienne gave a faint, controlled smile. "Everything we do is..." There was no pressure in her tone, but there was expectation. Caspian didn't refuse, but he didn't agree immediately either. "I'll think about it," he said. Vivienne nodded, as though that was enough. But inside, she had already decided. Because this gala was not just about business, it was about solidifying her position, permanently, across the city, far removed from the controlled elegance of that world. Zaraya stood in a space that reflected a very different kind of power. Her office was not extravagant, but it carried presence. Clean lines, minimal distractions, and an atmosphere that prioritized function over display. It was a place where decisions were made with clarity, not performance, and she stood at the center of it. "Everything is confirmed," one of her associates said, handing her a file. "The invitation has been extended formally." Zaraya took it, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the details. The gala, Halvern Dynamics, Caspian Hail. For a brief moment, the past and present existed in the same space, not colliding, but aligning. She had known this moment would come eventually, not because she had been waiting for it, but because life has a way of bringing things full circle when the time is right. "Are we attending?" her associate asked. Zaraya closed the file slowly, her gaze steady, her presence calm. "Yes," she said. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, because this was not about revisiting the past. It was about standing in the present and showing, without explanation, exactly who she had become. Later that evening, she sat with Kael and Cairo, the soft glow of the room casting a calm atmosphere around them. "We'll be attending an event soon," she said. Cairo looked up immediately, curiosity lighting his expression. "A big one?" Zaraya allowed a small smile. "Yes, a very important one." Kael tilted his head slightly. "Do we need to prepare?" Zaraya met his gaze. "You always prepare," she replied. There was a quiet understanding in that moment, not of what was coming, but of its importance, because while they did not yet know it, this event would change something fundamental, not just for Zaraya, not just for Caspian, but for them, because the truth that had been buried for 6 years was about to step into the light, and when it did, there would be no controlling the outcome. The night of the gala arrived, wrapped in elegance and expectation. The venue stood illuminated against the evening sky, its grand architecture reflecting the kind of wealth and influence that didn't need to announce itself loudly to be understood. Inside, the atmosphere carried a quiet intensity, conversations layered over soft music, glasses clinking lightly, and the subtle exchange of power between people who were used to operating at the highest level. Everything was exactly as it was meant to be, controlled, refined, predictable. Caspian moved through the room with practiced ease, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. Conversations shifted when he entered them. Respect followed his name, and everything about him reflected the life he had built over the past 6 years. Beside him, Vivian embodied composure. Her gown was flawless, her posture precise, her expression carrying that same polished confidence she had always maintained. Together, they presented a picture that made sense to everyone watching. A future already decided, a union already accepted, but even within that perfection, there was something incomplete, something unspoken. "Everything is running smoothly," Vivian said quietly, her gaze scanning the room with satisfaction. Caspian nodded, though his attention seemed divided. "Good," he replied. The evening continued, unfolding exactly as planned. Guests arrived, conversations deepened, and the atmosphere settled into a rhythm of familiarity. Until it didn't, because there are moments that shift everything without warning. Moments that don't announce themselves. Moments that simply arrive. The entrance doors opened again. At first it didn't draw immediate attention. Another guest. Another arrival. Nothing unusual. But then, something changed. It started subtly. A pause in conversation near the entrance. A glance that lingered longer than expected. A shift in the air that moved quietly, but steadily, through the room. And then people began to notice. Zaraya Cole did not enter the room like someone seeking attention. She didn't need to. She walked in with a presence that commanded it naturally. Her gown was understated in design but powerful in execution, flowing effortlessly as she moved, the deep tones complementing her skin in a way that made her impossible to overlook. Her posture was straight, her expression calm, her gaze steady as she took in the room without hesitation. She did not look like someone returning. She looked like someone arriving, and behind her walked Kyle and Cairo, dressed with the same quiet elegance. Their presence mirrored hers, not in imitation, but in alignment. They moved with a confidence that did not come from arrogance, but from certainty. Their eyes observed everything, taking in the environment with a level of awareness that felt far beyond their years. The effect was immediate. Conversation slowed, heads turned, whispers began. Because even without knowing who she was, people could feel it. Power, not the loud performative kind, but the quiet, undeniable kind that settles into a room and reshapes it without asking permission. Across the hall, Caspian felt it before he saw it. Something shifted in the energy around him, something that pulled his attention without explanation. He turned, and for the first time in 6 years, he saw her. Time did not stop, but it slowed, because the woman standing at the entrance was not the same one he remembered, not the one he had walked away from, not the one whose name had been reduced to a scandal. This version of Zoraya was different, stronger, sharper, untouchable. There was no trace of uncertainty in her presence, no hint of the vulnerability he had once seen in her eyes. Only control, only clarity, only power. And beside her, 2 children, his breath caught, subtle, controlled, but real, because something about them felt familiar. Not in a way he could immediately explain, but in a way that unsettled something deep within him. Vivian followed his gaze, her expression remaining composed at first, until she saw who he was looking at. For a fraction of a second, something shifted, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough. "Who is that?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Caspian didn't answer immediately, because he already knew, and the realization was heavier than he expected. Zoraya's gaze moved through the room, not searching, not hesitant, intentional, and then it landed on him. Their eyes met. 6 years of silence, 6 years of distance, 6 years of separate lives, condensed into a single moment. There was no visible reaction from her, no surprise, no emotion displayed, only recognition. Caspian felt something tighten in his chest, something unfamiliar, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Not regret, not exactly, but something close, because standing there, looking at her now, he understood something he hadn't fully grasped before. She had not been broken by what happened. She had been shaped by it, and she had returned, stronger than anything he had ever known. The room continued to shift around them, whispers growing louder, curiosity spreading, attention focusing more clearly. But Zoraya did not move toward him. She didn't approach. She didn't acknowledge him beyond that single glance. Instead, she continued walking forward, her steps measured, her presence steady, her focus entirely her own. And in that moment, Caspian realized something that settled deeper than anything else. He had expected, somewhere in the back of his mind, that if he ever saw her again, there would be something unresolved, something emotional, something that connected them. But what stood before him now was a woman who no longer needed anything from him, and that realization was far more unsettling than anything else could have been. The night had only just begun, and already everything was changing. The room never fully recovered from her entrance. Even as conversations resumed and the music continued, there was a subtle shift in focus that refused to settle back into its original rhythm. Eyes followed Zoraya as she moved, not openly, but enough to signal curiosity that could not be ignored. People who had mastered the art of composure found themselves distracted, trying to place her, trying to understand why her presence carried such weight. Zoraya did not acknowledge any of it. She guided Kyle and Cairo forward with quiet ease, her hand resting lightly at the center of their backs, not controlling, not directing, but grounding. The boys moved naturally beside her, their awareness sharp, their posture reflecting the discipline she had instilled in them over the years. They were not overwhelmed, they were observant. "Remember what we discussed," Zoraya said softly, her voice low enough that only they could hear. Kyle nodded once, his expression calm. "Observe first." Cairo gave a small smile, "and don't react too quickly." Zoraya's lips curved slightly, a subtle approval passing through her gaze. Across the room, Caspian had not looked away. He couldn't, not because of shock alone, but because something about the moment refused to release its hold on him. The image of her walking in, composed, untouchable, entirely in control, replayed in his mind with a clarity that unsettled him more than he expected. And then there were the children. His gaze shifted to them again, more focused now, more deliberate. There was something about their presence that felt familiar, not just in appearance, though there were subtle similarities he couldn't quite place yet, but in the way they carried themselves. The calm confidence, the quiet awareness, the sense that they belonged wherever they stood. It stirred something in him, something instinctive. Vivian noticed the shift immediately. She followed his line of sight again, this time with more attention, more intent. Her gaze lingered on Zariah, then moved to the children, her expression still composed but no longer neutral. She didn't ask another question. Not yet. Because she didn't need to. Instead, she observed. And Vivienne Laurent was very good at observing. "Stay here," Caspian said after a moment, his voice quieter than usual. Vivian turned slightly toward him, her expression unchanged. "And where are you going?" There was a brief pause, just long enough to matter. "I need to speak with someone," he replied. He didn't wait for a response. He moved. Zariah saw him approaching before he reached her. Of course she did. She had been aware of his presence from the moment she stepped into the room, even if she hadn't acknowledged it openly. Awareness had always been part of who she was, and tonight it was sharper than ever. Kyle noticed it too. His gaze shifted slightly, his posture adjusting in a way that was almost imperceptible. "Someone's coming toward us," he said quietly. Zariah didn't look at him. "I know." Cairo glanced up, curiosity flickering across his face. "Is it important?" Zariah's expression remained calm. "Yes," she said. Caspian stopped a few steps away. Close enough to speak, not close enough to assume familiarity. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them held 6 years of silence, of unanswered questions, of decisions that had reshaped everything they once were. "You look," he began, but the words didn't come together the way he intended. Zariah spared him the effort. "I look exactly as I should," she said. Her tone wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was controlled, measured, final. Caspian exhaled slightly, nodding once as if accepting that. "You've done well," he said. Zariah met his gaze fully now. "I didn't do it for recognition." There was no arrogance in her voice, no need to prove anything, just truth. Caspian's attention shifted again, this time not by accident, but with intention. "To the children, they're yours?" he asked. Zariah didn't answer immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of the question. "Yes," she said. Cairo looked between them, his curiosity sharpening. Kyle remained still, his eyes focused on Caspian now, studying him with a quiet intensity that felt far beyond his years. Caspian took a step closer, his gaze lingering just a moment longer than it should have. "How old are they?" he asked. 6, Zariah replied. The number settled heavily. Because it aligned too perfectly. Something shifted in Caspian's expression. Subtle, controlled, but undeniable. A realization forming, not complete, not confirmed, but present. Zariah saw it, and she didn't interrupt it. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, allowed the pieces to begin falling into place on their own. Behind them, Vivian had not remained still. She approached with the same composed elegance she had maintained all evening, her presence calm, her expression carefully neutral, but there was something sharper beneath it now, something watchful. "Caspian," she said, her voice smooth as she stepped beside him. "You disappeared." Her gaze moved to Zariah, taking her in fully this time, measured, evaluated, and then to the children. For the first time, there was a flicker of something she could not fully mask. Recognition, not of who they were, but of what they might mean. "And who might this be?" Vivian asked, her tone polite, but edged with something else entirely. Zariah met her gaze without hesitation. "Someone who doesn't need an introduction," she replied calmly. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. Vivian smiled, just slightly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I see," she said. But she didn't. Not fully, not yet. And that uncertainty was the first crack in the control she had maintained for years. The tension between them settled into the space, quiet but undeniable, not loud, not dramatic, but present, and beneath it all, the truth waited, because what had begun as curiosity was about to turn into revelation, and when it did, there would be no controlling the outcome. The tension did not explode immediately. It tightened, slowly, deliberately, like a moment holding its breath before everything changed. Vivian stood poised, her expression composed, her posture flawless, but her eyes were no longer relaxed. They moved carefully between Zariah and the children, observing, calculating, searching for something she could define and control, but control was already slipping. "Caspian," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to draw subtle attention. "We should rejoin the others. There are announcements to be made." Her words were intentional, a reminder, a shift back to structure, to the narrative she had been building all night. But Caspian didn't move. His focus remained on Zariah, on the children, on the realization that was no longer forming, but solidifying. 6 years, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Zariah didn't respond. She didn't interrupt, because this part was not hers to explain. It was his to understand. Kyle watched him closely, his sharp mind already connecting pieces that had not been spoken aloud. Cairo, though less analytical, felt the shift just as strongly, his expression growing more serious as he looked between the adults. Vivian's composure tightened. "Caspian," she repeated, this time firmer. "This isn't the time." Zariah turned her gaze toward her, calm, steady, and completely unbothered. "You're right," she said. A brief pause. Then, "It's long overdue." The words were quiet, but they carried enough that nearby conversations began to fade. Not entirely, but enough, because attention was shifting. Caspian finally spoke again, his voice lower now, controlled but edged with something deeper. "You didn't tell me." Zariah held his gaze, unflinching. "You didn't stay." The response was immediate, precise, undeniable. A ripple moved through the space, not loud, but felt. Vivian stepped forward slightly, her control sharpening into something more direct. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said smoothly, her tone still refined, but no longer soft. "Whatever this is, it doesn't belong here." Zariah's eyes moved to her again, measured, unmoved. "No," she said calmly. "It belongs exactly here." And then, she shifted her attention, not to Caspian, not to Vivian, but to the room, because whether people had been openly listening or not, they were now. "You built your reputation on precision," Zariah said, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach beyond their immediate circle. "On control, on making the right decisions when it matters most." Caspian didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Zariah continued, her tone never rising, never breaking. "But 6 years ago, you made a decision without truth. The air changed, based on something that was never real," she added. Vivian's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough. "That's not something you can prove," Vivian said, her voice cutting in, controlled but sharper now. Zariah didn't look at her immediately. When she did, it was with quiet certainty. "I don't need to prove it," she said. A pause. Then, "You already know." That landed, not loudly, but deeply. Vivian's composure held, but only just, because doubt, when turned in the opposite direction, becomes exposure. Caspian's gaze moved between them, something unraveling in real time. "Vivian," he said slowly, "what is she talking about?" Vivian didn't answer right away. For the first time that night, she hesitated, and that hesitation was everything. Kyle stepped slightly closer to Zariah, his voice calm but clear. "Mom," he said, just loud enough. "Is this the man you told us about?" The word landed. "Mom." Caspian's breath caught. Cairo looked at him now, really looked at him, his expression thoughtful, searching. You said he made a choice, he added. Silence. Not the quiet kind, the heavy kind, because, now, there was no avoiding it. Zariah rested her hand gently on their shoulders, her presence grounding, her voice steady. Yes, she said. Caspian's world shifted, not metaphorically, not emotionally, but completely, because everything he had ignored, everything he had buried, everything he had chosen not to confront, was standing in front of him, alive, real, undeniable. There, he started, but the words didn't form. Zariah finished it for him. Yours. The word didn't echo. It didn't need to, because the impact was immediate. The room reacted in waves, whispers, glances, shock that moved quietly but unmistakably through the crowd. Vivian stepped back slightly, her control breaking, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough that the shift was clear. No, she said, her voice lower now, less certain. That's not, but she didn't finish, because there was nothing to finish with. Caspian looked at the boys again, really looked this time, not as strangers, not as distant possibilities, but as something else entirely. Connection. Kyle met his gaze without hesitation. Cairo tilted his head slightly, studying him with open curiosity, and in that moment, there was no denying it, not just in appearance, but in presence. Caspian took a step back, his composure slipping for the first time in years. You said, he began, his voice quieter now. You said she. He stopped, because now, he understood. The accusation, the investigation, the timing, the distance, it had all aligned too perfectly. Vivian, he turned toward her slowly, his expression no longer controlled. What did you do? For the first time, she didn't have an answer ready. And that was her exposure, not through confession, not through proof, but through silence. Zariah didn't stay for what came next. She didn't need to. Her truth had been spoken, not loudly, not emotionally, but clearly, and that was enough. She turned, guiding Kyle and Cairo with her, her steps steady, her presence unchanged. The room parted without being asked, because everyone understood something now. She had not returned for attention, she had returned for closure, and she had taken it without asking for permission. Behind her, everything unraveled. Quietly, publicly, irreversibly, and Caspian Hale stood in the center of it all, realizing, too late, that the life he had walked away from had become something he could never control again. The gala did not end with a formal closing, it dissolved. What had been carefully constructed over months unraveled in a matter of minutes, not through chaos, but through the quiet collapse of control. Conversations shifted, alliances subtly adjusted, and the image that had once defined the evening no longer held its shape. Caspian remained where he stood, long after Zariah walked away. The noise around him faded into something distant, indistinct, like a world he was no longer fully present in. People spoke to him, some offering polite concern, others attempting to redirect the situation, but none of it settled, because his focus had already moved beyond that room. He left without announcement, no final remarks, no attempt to regain control of the narrative. For the first time in years, Caspian Hale walked away from something without calculating how it would be perceived. Outside, the night air felt sharper than it had before, not colder, just clearer. His thoughts did not move in order, they collided, fragments of memory, rising all at once. Zariah standing in that apartment, her voice steady as she told him she was pregnant. The hesitation that followed, the distance he created, the moment he chose silence over trust, and now, the result of that choice stood in front of him with undeniable clarity. 2 sons, 6 years, an entire life he had not been part of. Caspian exhaled slowly, his composure cracking in a way that no one had ever witnessed before, not publicly, not privately, because this wasn't just regret, it was realization. And realization, when it arrives too late, carries a weight that cannot be ignored. He found them outside, not far from the entrance, but far enough removed from the noise of the event. Zariah stood with Kyle and Cairo, her posture relaxed but alert, her presence still carrying that same quiet authority that had filled the room moments earlier. She didn't look surprised to see him. She had expected it. The boys noticed him first. Kael's gaze sharpened slightly, assessing. Cairo's expression shifted into something more curious than guarded. Zariah turned slowly, meeting Caspian's eyes without hesitation. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Caspian stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance. "I need to talk to you," he said. Zariah's expression remained unchanged. "You already did," she replied. Her tone wasn't dismissive, but it wasn't open either. Caspian nodded slightly, accepting that. "No," he said, "not like this." A pause settled between them, one that carried more weight than the conversation itself. Zariah studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether this was worth engaging in. Then she turned slightly toward the boys. "Give us a moment," she said gently. Kael didn't question it. He simply nodded, placing a hand lightly on Cairo's shoulder as they stepped a short distance away, close enough to remain within view, but far enough to allow space. Now it was just the two of them, again, but nothing about this felt like before. Caspian ran a hand through his hair, the movement less controlled than it once would have been. "I didn't know," he said. Zariah's gaze didn't soften. "You didn't ask." The words landed immediately. No room for interpretation, no space to shift blame. Caspian exhaled slowly, his shoulders tightening slightly. "I thought," he started, then stopped, because whatever he had thought no longer mattered. "I was wrong," he said instead. Zariah didn't respond right away. She let the words sit, not rejecting them, but not accepting them either. "That doesn't change anything," she said finally. Caspian nodded, though the weight of that truth was clear in his expression. "I know," he replied. "But it should have." There was a pause, longer this time. His gaze shifted briefly toward the boys, then back to her. "They're mine," he said, not as a question, but as something he was still trying to fully grasp. "Yes," Zariah replied. Another silence followed, not empty, but heavy with everything that had been lost. "I should have been there," he said quietly. Zariah's expression shifted slightly, not into softness, but into something more reflective. "You should have," she agreed. There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, just truth. Caspian looked at her, something deeper settling into his gaze. "I want to know them," he said. The statement was direct, unfiltered. Zariah didn't respond immediately. Her eyes moved briefly toward Kael and Cairo, watching them as they stood together, speaking quietly, completely unaware of the weight of the conversation happening nearby. When she looked back at Caspian, her expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough. "This isn't about what you want," she said. Her tone remained calm, but firm. "They have a life," she continued. "A stable one. One that wasn't built with uncertainty." Caspian nodded slowly, understanding what she was saying. "You don't trust me," he said. Zariah met his gaze directly. "No," she replied. There was no hesitation, no attempt to soften it, and somehow, that honesty carried more weight than anything else. Caspian absorbed it, the reality settling in fully now, not just what he had lost, but what he would have to face moving forward. "I'm not asking for everything," he said after a moment. "I'm asking for a chance." Zariah studied him carefully, not emotionally, but deliberately, because this wasn't about her anymore. It was about them, and what was best for them. "They will know the truth," she said finally. Caspian's breath caught slightly. "But that doesn't mean you become part of their world overnight," she continued. Her voice remained steady, measured. "You don't get to step into their lives like nothing happened." Caspian nodded. He understood that he had to. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. Zariah held his gaze for a moment longer. Then, she gave a small nod, not agreement, not acceptance, but possibility. "Then start with patience," she said. And just like that, the door wasn't opened, but it wasn't completely closed either. The weeks following the gala did not bring immediate resolution. They brought reality. Caspian did not attempt to force his way into their lives. For the first time in a long time, he understood that control was no longer his to exercise. The situation he now faced could not be negotiated, managed, or strategically resolved the way he handled everything else in his world. This was different. This required patience, consistency, accountability. And so, he started there. The first time he saw Kyle and Cairo again, it was not at a grand event or in a setting that reflected his status. It was in a quiet, open park on a calm afternoon, where the environment felt neutral, safe even. Zariah was present, not hovering, not intervening, but watching. Kyle stood slightly behind Cairo at first, his gaze focused, studying Caspian with the same quiet intensity he had shown at the gala. He wasn't resistant, but he wasn't open either. He observed, measured, calculated. Cairo, on the other hand, stepped forward first, not impulsively, but with curiosity that outweighed hesitation. "You're the man from that night," he said, his voice calm but direct. Caspian nodded slowly. Yes. There was a brief pause before Cairo asked the question that mattered most. "Are you our father?" The simplicity of it carried more weight than any formal conversation ever could. Caspian didn't rush his answer. He didn't look at Zariah for guidance. He didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. Cairo absorbed it with a quiet nod, as though filing the information into place. Kyle stepped forward then, his expression unchanged. "Why weren't you there before?" he asked. The question was not emotional. It wasn't asked with anger. It was asked with clarity. And that made it harder to answer. Caspian exhaled slowly, lowering himself slightly so he was at their level, not out of obligation but out of respect. "I made a mistake," he said. "I believed something that wasn't true, and instead of finding out the truth, I walked away." Kyle held his gaze, processing. "You chose to leave," he said. Caspian nodded. Yes. There was no defense, no excuse, just truth. Cairo glanced between them, then asked softly, "Are you going to leave again?" The question landed deeper than anything else. Caspian's expression shifted, something more grounded settling into place. "No," he said. "Not if I'm given the chance to stay." Zariah watched the exchange quietly, her expression composed, but her attention sharp. She wasn't evaluating his words. She was evaluating his consistency, because words had never been the issue. Time passed slowly after that, not in a way that dragged, but in a way that required intention. Caspian showed up, again, and again, and again, not with grand gestures, not with attempts to impress, but with presence. He listened more than he spoke. He learned who they were, not who he expected them to be. He adjusted. He stayed. Kyle began to respond first, not emotionally, but with acceptance. He allowed conversation, engaged in small discussions, tested boundaries quietly. Cairo followed in his own way, with openness, with questions, with a natural curiosity that made connection easier, and, slowly, a foundation began to form. But Zariah remained unchanged, not cold, not distant, but firm. She acknowledged his effort. She respected his consistency. But she did not blur the lines she had drawn, because for her, this was not about revisiting the past. It was about protecting what she had built. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air settled into a quiet calm, Zariah stood outside watching Kyle and Cairo a short distance away. They were speaking with Caspian, their voices carrying lightly, their presence relaxed. Caspian approached her after a while, his steps measured, his expression thoughtful. "They're remarkable," he said. Zariah nodded once. "I know." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but honest. "I see parts of you in them," he added. Zariah's gaze remained on her children. "They are their own people," she replied. Caspian nodded, accepting that. Another silence followed before he spoke again. "I'm not expecting anything from you," he said. "I know I lost that." Zariah finally looked at him, not with anger, not with softness, but with clarity. "Yes," she said. The word was simple, but it carried finality. Caspian didn't look away. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I don't lose this," he said, his gaze shifting toward the boys. Zariah followed his line of sight. For a moment, something softer passed through her expression. Not love, not the kind that once existed, but something quieter, understanding. You already did once, she said. Caspian nodded. I know. There was nothing else to add to that. Because some truths don't need elaboration. The past was not something they could return to. It was not something they could rebuild. But the future was still unwritten. Zaraya turned slightly, her posture steady, her presence unchanged. She had not been broken. She had not been defined by what happened to her. She had risen beyond it, and now she stood in a place where she no longer needed closure, because she had created something greater, a life built on strength, on purpose, on truth. And while Caspian had found his way back into part of that life, he would never again hold all of it, not her heart. That was something he had lost the moment he chose doubt over trust. And some losses are meant to remain, but even in that, there was something meaningful, because the love they once shared had not disappeared completely. It had changed into something quieter, something more distant, something that no longer needed to be held onto, to be respected. And sometimes, that is what makes a story complete.